Hey guys, Matt Gray, Cheltenham UK Philosophers. Um, Please do remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Really means a lot to me and helps the algorithm and all that jazz. Um, Denis came back for a third time today, and he was his normal, customary, charming, funny self. That's one of the things I notice about Denis is that he's always laughing, right? He brings a sort of an energy and humour and humanity to the proceedings, which is rare in science, perhaps. Not with my guests. But anyway, today we had the advantage of having Raymond Noble. So we had the brothers professors Noble today. Raymond is a theoretical biologist who looks at the sort of nature of causality, causation in biological systems, and how organisms make decisions. Essentially, he sort of emphasises that within this conversation. He studied zoology at Manchester University in the 70s. He's got a PhD in neuroscience from Edinburgh University. He's also he works in women's health, which is awesomely cool. And he served as the Deputy Dean of Life Sciences at University College London, UCL, and just does loads of tons of cool things. As he mentioned in the interview and conversation today, he wears lots of hats. But today's conversation was beautiful. It was about evolutionary biology. It was about philosophy, living things, what they are, what we are, right? And how it's so important that we frame ourselves in the right way, or at least in some way that's close to our true situation, in order to perhaps move through some of the crises that face us today. Yeah, hope you enjoy this. I'd love to speak to these gentlemen again, either together or individually. And also, I want to promote their work as musicians as well. The Oxford Troubadours, truly remarkable 12th century obscure French pop music, essentially. Really, really good fun. And these guys can sing, and they've got a great band with them. I'd strongly recommend. I'm going to put some links in the video description, and yeah, check them out. If you wait till the end of the video, actually, I've included some of their material. I hope they don't mind. But it's just beautiful. So enjoy. Speak soon. Bye bye. Hello.
Hello.
How are
Can you?
you?
Hello, you're Matt.
I am Matt. Pleasure
Good.
to have you, Ray. Thank you so much for coming along.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm hoping I'm going to be okay. I've not been very well,
Oh dear,
and
right. I've had a bit of a cold. What's been afflicting you, Ray?
just in case I start coughing and spluttering and so on, but every now and again it catches me and it becomes difficult. But there
Hmm.
it is. Now
Yeah,
then, where's Dennis? Is Dennis with us?
he's going to be joining us shortly, I hope. We're a bit early.
Yes, I spoke to him earlier and and told him that I was okay to go ahead with it. So that, is a very good thing.
Brilliant.
What ideas do you have about how we'll proceed?
Well, actually, Dennis sent me a list of possible subjects, and
Yes,
they were basically why purpose, why is it
yes,
definitive of living things,
yes,
and why is the central dogma neither central nor a dogma?
yes,
It's
that's
just
right.
incorrect.
That's right.
Also,
Yes,
the significance of epigenetics,
yes,
and also to talk through the various types of selection and sort of asking
yeah,
the question why do the neo-Darwinists favour natural selection over the other forms?
yes.
So that's a really quite a meaty list of things to be.
It's a big list, and we'll
Mm,
just have to see how far we can get with them.
mm,
Some of them, I mean, my feeling is that sometimes some of them are more. Um, Actually, they're all philosophical, really, when you look at.
mm.
You're a philosopher, aren't you, in background?
I'd like to think so. I mean, I was going to ask you actually, are you a philosopher first and then a biologist, or is it the other way
Well,
around?
well, it's a very interesting point,
Isn't
Matt.
it?
I mean, I was going to say this in our discussion, which I may well do. So forgive me if I'd end up repeating myself. But you see, I started out um, before my academic career. I mean, I left school very early. I mean, I was 15 years old.
Mm,
That's neither here nor there, except other than the fact that it's a crucial part of the background. And
mm,
my interests were in that led me here were in politics, philosophy, and economics
mm,
initially. And back then in the 1960s, I was pretty engaged politically. I am still in that sense. How can you not be? I mean,
mm. Yes, certainly these days.
Um, yeah, exactly. And but the crucial thing there is that I mean, and I, my trajectory, if there was going to be one academically at all, because I had to get to university somehow, was initially in politics, philosophy, and economics, and I studied those subjects at that
Mm,
time. Now, I there were three key bits of philosophy, if you like, that kind of got me sort of interested and started on the questions that we're going to address. One, which is relevant in, as we'll see in the discussion, one curiously was Karl Marx, um, because I was interested in politics. Of course, I read masses of Marx and various other philosophers of economics and so on.
mm-hmm,
And but one startling um, statement by Marx sort of struck me as being the core of the problem. And that was that it is not the consciousness of man that determines his existence, but his existence that determines his consciousness. Now, when I saw this,
mm,
uh, I immediately saw a kind of a problem in a sense, which is that surely both interact with each other. I mean,
mm,
what we do in terms of desires, needs, hopes, fears, anxieties, loves, hates, discussions, ideas, interact in such a way that they can indeed influence the materiality, even if one wants to regard them as non-material in the first place.
mm,
Is an immateriality. It is that concept of shared ideas, if you like. There's the sharing, which doesn't have anything obvious other than sound waves and a
mm,
materiality point of view, we've got speech and signs and things like that that influence others.
mm,
So it's that influence of others, which I always saw as being this crucial outer layer, if you like, of organization that in its own way, through its own means, was interactive with the physical system.
mm.
So it tried so in a sense trying to avoid the sort of dualism
Yeah.
by seeing it as an interactive process between layers of organization, sort of a nested functionality, if you like. So
Mm,
cells are
mm,
within tissues, and so cells are influenced by being in tissues, by other cells within the tissue and other tissues. The
mm,
tissues are within organ systems, they're organized as systems, and so there's a layer of organization. And each
mm.
layers of organization are kind of a nested within each other. And when you look at causative flow, it's not as if you could ever start somewhere and say, this is where something starts and this is where something finishes in terms of output, because there's
Yes.
a continuous process flowing of information or influence through each of those layers in all directions, particularly also in a parallel way. So
Right.
one layer can indicate it can you can have interactions with one layer, such as the social layer, for example,
Mm.
occurring transgenerationally to start off with. So not just simply involved in an
Hello,
individual.
Dennis, by the way.
Oh,
I
hi,
thought we,
Dennis.
I thought we ought to say
I
hello. You
haven't we haven't started, Dennis. I was just simply well, I suppose it
That's
was rehearsing,
okay.
explaining
Well,
who I
this
am.
is this is Matt's style. He started without Carl Friston when I first
Oh, really?
contacted him,
Well, if
and Carl came in later and had no idea what we were talking about, and I've no idea what you're talking about, except that I think I heard levels.
Yes. Yes.
heard what? Levels,
Mm.
layers.
Yes.
I
We
prefer the word layers rather than levels as such.
right.
Partly because we don't. I mean, one of the things that, Denis and I kind of agree on is that there isn't really a privileged level as such.
Mm,
The only other thing I'd say about that, though, is that when you consider it, if there were to be a privilege level, I would suggest and I'm sure that Dennis probably agrees, that that privilege level would indeed be that level of interactiveness with others. Simply because
mm,
that's where there's a kind of strangeness in a sense about that has influenced so much of what you see in terms of the faculty of the materiality. I
mm.
mean, I'm using my hands at the moment to discuss this with you. Now, that's a fascinating thing. Goodness
Indeed.
knows what all this means. But we know that we signal to each other in various ways. We
Mm.
manipulate the environment in various ways. Excuse me.
Well, and
So,
also, Ray, you as a neurophysiologist showed many years ago in work in Edinburgh that the sensory systems, like the sensation of touch, in a sense, are determined by what the center tells them to do in order to understand what is being recorded. And that has a long philosophical tradition. I remember Stuart Hampshire, whom I interacted with as a student at University College London, making a major point out of the fact that the world is not just a camera, or we are not just a camera recording the world. We actually have action. Well, his book, Thought and Action, of course, had that title for that reason. But he was saying, in effect, that we are determining what it is that we can actually sense in the world. And other organisms can sense things that we can't sense.
Mm.
That is true both of light, of touch, of smell, particularly. Why do we take dogs and pigs to gather truffles in the oak forests of the south of France? You know, I think this is, it's been a major mistake of biological science to give the impression that everything is really fixed by, well, we know what we're going to come on to, of
Mm,
course, fixed by the central dogma, fixed by the selfish gene idea, fixed by a one-way process from the molecular up towards the higher levels, and no way can it be the other way round. And
mm,
the reason why Ray and I wrote Understanding Living Systems, we thought, well, enough is enough. You
mm,
know, it's so blindingly obvious that this is not corresponding with what people actually
mm,
experience in their own
mm,
lives. So this is not just a piece of philosophical speculation, it's simple fact.
mm.
And that's
Yeah.
what Ray's work showed many years ago, that we discriminate according to what our nervous systems tell the sensory organs to do. Just
Mm,
fascinating and fabulous.
yeah.
This introduces me to a point where I wanted at least to be able to begin, which is that actually Ray and I came to writing this book by quite different routes. That may not be totally obvious from the book itself, but he came through a very strongly philosophical
Mm,
approach. And I think we probably should ask Ray to explain how on earth he got into all of this and why is purpose so absolutely central, even definitive of what it is to be an organism. And I think if we begin there, we'll be able to make progress through the other three or four points where I think we differ fundamentally from the major stream of 20th century biology. The 21st century has to be complete
mm.
change.
Yeah, but just very briefly before we continue, these days, to me and a number of my friends, we think it's crazier to suppose that nature doesn't have purpose. It now seems crazier to say that. You know, with
Yes.
all the emergent findings around mycelial networks, Mike Levin's work, it's just there's a groundswell. I mean, I was listening to one of your old friends, George Ellis. He was on a podcast.
Yes.
He's a physicist saying that reductionism is a
Indeed.
done deal. He
Well,
a physicist.
well, of course,
He worked with Hawking, and he's talking about top down causation. You know.
exactly so.
Mm,
No, I mean, he's appreciated the point, of course, and the physicists have bounced back, many of
mm.
them, like George, from um, going right down to the bottom and finding, well, it's rather weird down
Mm.
there.
I'll say.
I think that people wanted to dispense with any idea that there was a sort of a directedness. And there is a fundamental difference, of course, between directional and directed. To say that something is directed presupposes that it starts here with a particular kind of set of causes to achieve a particular objective, and then it causes things to happen that achieve that objective. Now, I contend that indeed you find that all the way in biology. You find that that is the nature of maintaining the integrity of self, which is what is definitive of living things, in my view, is exactly that. It is a driven purposiveness to so much of what it is that living organisms do. And an awful lot of their constraints are to do with faculties, the ability to do something. And in evolution is all about creating different ways of doing things, different ways of achieving purpose. That's crucial. Otherwise, why on earth evolve if there was no objective in a sense? So yes, of course, you can say, well, the objective wasn't known. That's certainly true. But you can have directionality without necessarily implying that there was a director. And I mean, Denis will confirm that one of the questions that would be asked of us when we first started out on these issues was, but doesn't this let God back in? You know, if you introduce purpose to things, where does this purpose come from? Because it doesn't.
Yes.
It comes from the nature of nature itself.
Mm,
It comes
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
processes that are living organisms, and it's definitive of organisms.
mm,
It isn't something that materializes by emergence in the sense. It's not, in other words, you have to look for a particular organizational level before suddenly you've got purpose.
mm,
Otherwise, it begs the question, well, what exactly is it that emerges that gives you that purpose? It's definitively. So even this tiniest cell has that definitive purposefulness.
mm,
It has processes of achieving the maintenance of integrity within the point of its functionality. I mean, our cells of our skin don't continue to maintain integrity, but as part of the organism, actually the loss of those cells is part of the process of maintaining the integrity. So even the cells of the skin, which by the process of maintaining integrity of the living system will die. And indeed, cells have a process of dying. They don't just simply fail, as it were, and die. I mean, some cells do, of course, in disease states and things like this. They actually have a process. If they're going into a process, into the situation where they're going to die, they have a process of death. There is a process of cell death. And that's crucial because you don't want to harm other cells that are surrounding it in the tissue. You want to protect those from the toxins and various other things that are a consequence of death. So there's even purposefulness within the process of dying in cells and
Indeed.
in organisms. So it seems to me that it, and to us, that it's definitive of life. If you say, what is it that distinguishes living things from non-living things, it would be that kind of integrative purposefulness, and I mean a purposefulness which is directed overall to maintaining the integrity of the system.
mm,
Now, many cosmologists tell me that, well, you could say within the span of 1 billion years, you can say that about a galaxy. I can see the problem that arises out of that. We don't think we've solved every single problem of physics and philosophy in relation to this. Of course, there are difficult questions that we know need to be addressed, and the concept of consciousness, for example, is consciousness something which is definitive in itself, or is it just simply the being of a living system? That is something so fundamental of any living system that all living things are conscious by the nature of their integrity, by the nature of their maintaining their integrity. There's nothing special about it at all. And yet we give consciousness some sort of speciality, some specialness that is almost immaterial. And that, I think, is one of the crucial mistakes, is to look for something within the system that directs the system. We've talked about a materialist dualism in our book and elsewhere, where the genome is seen as being a director. Well, the genome doesn't direct anything.
Doesn't replicate.
A genome is directed, and it's directed by an integrative system. It can only function within and as part of an integrative system. That, it seems to me, probably is true of whatever we think of as consciousness too, that it is in part a directed system. Now you may say, well, that sounds very strange, because we're so used to thinking that if there's consciousness, it's that which thinks, it's that which has self-awareness, it's strange immateriality. But you don't necessarily need the immateriality other than the words we may use to discuss it, other than the signs that we may use to influence others, other than the signs that you have that kind of awareness of self and I have that kind of awareness of self. And actually, part of my awareness of self is the awareness of you. So that is indeed an immateriality, but it's not of the kind that is otherworldliness.
Yeah, in fact, actually, very briefly, this reminds me of what Denis mentioned earlier, that this is closer to a common sense or pragmatic interpretation. When I see a dog yelp, I infer that it's experiencing pain.
Thing, exactly, Matt. The strange thing is that science has ignored common sense as though it's wrong. But actually, the boot is on the other foot. And of course, what we do in understanding living systems is to pull the central dogma of molecular biology. We pull it apart. It's incorrect. It's neither central to biology, nor is it a dogma. There are no dogmas in science. Come on.
And you can show this now. You can show this now, can't you?
Well, or not only show it, demonstrably and completely so. First of all, DNA is not capable of operating outside a living cell, and it won't self-replicate accurately enough for the organism to pass its DNA on to the next living cells, the daughter cells. And it waits until laboriously its cut and paste enzymes have corrected all the errors that will be created by self-replication. If you can't self-replicate, then right at the beginning of Crick's central dogma, where he has arrows that show the self-replication of DNA and RNA, they're solid arrows. And that's an inheritance of an idea from Schrödinger that the self-replication is highly accurate. It's not. It forms one error in about 5,000 base pairs. We've got 3 billion. That just destroys the very beginning of the central dogma. The causation, therefore, if you want to talk about causation in such a multi-layered system, comes from the way the organism uses DNA. DNA is just a database. No more. It's not the blueprint for life. We show all of that in our little book. And the other extraordinary thing, and I think this is largely attributable to the fact that Ray has a skill. He writes novels too. So he has a skill of communicating in completely lay language. So we've tried to remove in this little book, Understanding Living Systems, almost all acronyms other than DNA itself, because nobody even knows what deoxyribonucleic acid is amongst the public. They just know it's DNA. But all other acronyms are gone, no more acronyms, and all the technical words have been dissected into the way in which you can explain them in lay language. I think anybody could read it and understand biology.
I think that's really important. That's so important that people understand this, because this will help us reframe our own human self-image, right?
We have to do so
it's far easier to send deterministic robots into battle, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And you're absolutely right, Matt, for another reason. We are now the drivers of evolution. We are now the determinants of the ecosystem. We are responsible for destroying it. And we end the book with a plea to the next generation. It's up to you now to correct all of this, because we've made a mess.
But do you
I
think
say we, it isn't just Ray and me.
Do you think you're winning the fight?
20th century biology has led us down the wrong route, even for the future of humanity.
Yeah.
In fact, if I could take us back a little bit in terms of back to my history again. Sorry about that. We lost it in the enthusiasm for the discussion and for pragmatism. We're in favor of pragmatism. And in fact, indeed, people shrug their shoulders. If I was talking to somebody at a bus stop and I was telling them all this, they shrug their shoulders and say, well, doesn't everybody think that? It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Science has divorced itself from commonality. It's divorced itself from. I mean, it's partly because it tries to be rigid in the. We're here to maintain genes in a gene pool. Well, this gene pool doesn't exist any more than any other kind of spirituality exists. It doesn't exist. There is no gene pool. It doesn't exist. It's not something you can dive into from a height and have fun with in that kind of sense. It exists within us. But but this kind of the ability of scientists to try and separate things out, even the concept of genome, that we can discreetly say there's this omics, this dreadful thing of omics, and that people then nest into this kind of study of their particular omic. Denis and I are physiologists. Well, physiologists do not study one bit of the system, really. I mean, this is the truth. They tried to, it failed, because you can't put the thing together. You can't just simply say, well, because these cells all function like this, so you study the individual cell. And then you say, well, the organisms of, a bunch of these cells all acting together. So we'll put them together now. And what do you get? You get very funny things if you try and model it. I'm treading on Denis's toes now. If you try and model it, you find there are all sorts of strangenesses that occur. The modeling of the individual cell doesn't actually model what the cells do when they're combined.
Partial. Totally partial and very deterministic, which is not the case, because I like the fact that Ray earlier on referred to even the tiniest organisms can do purpose. Take a bacterium, just 2 microns by 4 microns. That's got 20 billion water molecules. They are all jiggling around in Brownian motion, disturbing the genome, the proteins, the protein folding, the goodness knows what. This gives even that organism, so tiny, a vast range of stochasticity. What did Alan Turing write in 1950 when he predicted artificial intelligence? He said, you've got to have a random number generator there too. Organisms they've massive stochasticity. Out of that, as we know from our immune systems and from our nervous systems, what they do is to choose what they can make use of in all of that stochasticity. So the selecting is actually being done by the organism itself. That is also an active process. It's not purely passive.
Indeed, it's active and dynamic, and it's like a molding exercise with stochasticity. You can't. It's one of the reasons why sort of a fluid system is better than some sort of mechanical system. A system of process is better than a system of mechanics. That's not to deride mechanics. It's beautiful. You can understand an awful lot about the way I move my arm by studying it as mechanics. There's no doubt about that. But if you want to study it a little bit further in the system, the purpose of moving my arm is generated by processes that harness stochasticity and harness the looseness of water, if you like, and the processes going on within it, so that it can mold things, be creative. Without that, you can't get creativity out of cogs and wheels. Well, you could if you were doing a Meccano set. You might, one day create a crane, because you know the bits that are necessary for the crane. Now, in a curious kind of way, evolution is trying to do that. What it's trying to do is build a better crane, or a better whatever it is that is used. But it can only do that by harnessing the very changeable nature of the substance of nature. And it harnesses that, it molds it, it allows creativity to occur through that. And it generates in the end, I mean, this is my crane. I often say this to people. I'm whittling my fingers, you see. This is a crane, and it's beautifully shaped, beautifully controlled, and enabling me to manipulate things with great dexterity. I can do things with this that my dog cannot do because he doesn't have this crane. And evolution is about creating not just cranes like this, but cranes that might be paws for running fast or whatever, and for having hearing beyond a certain range in order to enhance their ability to hear a predator or hear a prey. And so the one of the things we say in the book is when you look at life, you do find these extraordinary, exquisite. I call them cranes now because
Well, you even find them,
I've
Ray.
just invented that term in relation to all this. You see, if you look at a Meccano set, you use the bits and pieces that you've got in order to create it. Well, what this living system has is a host of different kinds of processes in which can it can produce change. Without change, there can be no authentically novelty, if you like.
Yeah. Is there a
But
sense
while
in
you're
which
doing this, Ray, you see, I was thinking of what is an immunoglobulin?
There we are, you see.
It's something that has a shape
Yeah.
that captures a virus or a bacterium and locks into it by virtue of fitting accurately the shape of the bacterium. What does the immune system do when it finds it hasn't got an immunoglobulin that can do that? For example, with coronavirus, it tells its cells to randomly mutate and wait until at least one of them gets another immunoglobulin which has just the right shape to capture this virus. And that's what our immune systems were doing. And people say it doesn't happen. It was happening during the coronavirus pandemic. The immune system is a beautiful example of grabbing and getting accurate grabbing to the point where it actually neutralizes the action of the bacterium or the virus.
amazing how nature reuses those similar solutions and cranes,
Yeah.
as you put it.
At all levels of organization, that's the extraordinary thing. All
The
the way
grabbing.
up to our own hand, but even right down at the molecular level in what the immune system does with its immunoglobulins. I cannot understand why all of this isn't understood by standard science.
Well, you can also understand, you can also see it beautifully in, and an example, one of the examples we give in the book is chimpanzees cracking nuts. Now, it's
Yes, exactly.
such a simplistic thing. Of course, they crack nuts, and birds crack nuts as well. Throughout the system, throughout the animal system, you can find organisms that use implements to do things for purpose. Why would you have something? Why would you mold something if it didn't have purpose? So a stone can be used to crack a nut, and indeed chimpanzees do so. But not all chimpanzee groups do it. They learn to do it. If they don't learn to do it, they don't do it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And this is this interaction between, between each other. I'll show you how to do this, and then they perfect it. So one member of the group might know how better to perfect these things than others because he's more observant. If I make it sharper, if I make it flatter, or whatever it might be, they hone the stones in order to crack nuts. So they're always creating cranes. They're always generating new bits of machinery, if you like. The technology. And you don't have technology. If I show you a hammer and I said to you, what's this for? You might not argue with me about whether it has any purpose. You will say to me, well, I use that to hammer nails into wood. And I would say, yes, that's pretty good. Now, it's very strange. We are able to attribute purposefulness to the hammer. When it comes to the hand of the organism, don't we also think, well, that has purpose to grip a hammer and to use the hammer in various ways to achieve various objectives? Doesn't that also apply to the arm that moves the hand and positions it, and the positioning of the shoulder and the elbow and whatever it is into the system, and further you go into the entire system? We can attribute purpose to the system. Why would we suddenly cut off purpose here, or here, or here? It makes no sense to do that. Oh, yes, of course, the purpose is created.
Oh, we lost him there. So
I think Ray's frozen.
The system
He'll
itself.
come back in, I'm sure.
So just,
here we are. Yes, Ray, you froze briefly, but you made your point very clear.
So
that's all right.
Just want to play that back briefly. So you're saying that purpose isn't something that emerges in a system when it gets complicated enough. You're saying it's driven by purpose. Its very components are driven by local purposes and so on.
Yes, to some extent. And not wanting to, I don't want to make a dogma out of this, as it were, because it's done as a self-directing system in that sense. If you take any particular organ, so let's say the renal system, let's say, well, you could take the brain if you like. Different cells are doing slightly different things. There's a lot of specialization. This is what creates tissue. The specialization within tissues. In the heart, for example, is a specialization between those cells that generate the pacemaker currents and spread it through the system very fast. They spread the electrical current through the system so that the system is orchestrated to do what it does, you see. So you could say, well, the purpose of the sinoatrial node is to assist in that orchestration. So it's purposefulness within the functionality of the system. That functionality wouldn't exist without that system. I mean, sure, you can take, I'm sorry, I'm treading on Denis's toes because he's the guardian.
That's right. You do very well, Ray.
I'm sorry, Denis, I'm going to steal your thunder, which is terrible. But I was always struck by some modeling that Denis did. Denis's group did of the, correct me if I'm doing some of this completely wrong, Denis. But when they came to put the model together, so taking the sinoatrial node model, I think it was the sinoatrial node, which is the main pacemaker of the cell. When you put that model together as a mathematical model, wasn't it the case that it paced the wrong way?
Yes, that's right. The wave actually went in from the outside of the node to the center. Yes. And that's incorrect because it's the other way round. But then when we first presented this result, somebody in the audience from Leeds University at that time, Mark Boyd, said, Denis, you're right, because when I dissect the sinus node out from the atrium of the heart, it does go from the periphery down to the center. It's only when it sits in the heart that it goes from the center out to the periphery. The rest of the heart actually forces that on the sinus node. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, so function.
You've got it absolutely right, Ray. But I tell you, one of the things I nearly got wrong at the very beginning when I was first putting pacemaker mechanisms together in modeling the heart was this was back in 1960 when well, computers were almost unknown. No mobile phones, no desktops, no screen, no graphics, just a bunch of valves in a huge machine costing millions of pounds. And there was one in University College London where I was working at the time as a student. And I knew that if I was going to reconstruct the way the proteins of a heart cell interact with its cell membrane and the voltage across the cell membrane to produce rhythm in the heart, I would need a fast computer. Well, fast, it was quite slow in those days, but it was actually a successor of the computers Colossus that were used to decode the German signals during the Second World War. Alan Turing went to Manchester to construct this machine, and one was made also at University College London. And when I went to the guardians of this magnificent machine and asked for time on it, you see, they looked at my equations and they said, well, Mr. Noble, I was just Mr. in those days and not yet with the thesis. Where's the oscillator in your equations? They thought it was absolutely necessary for there to be a sine wave oscillator in the equations for rhythm to emerge. Now, what I should have said if I was the Denis Noble of today is there's no need for one. It is a property of the system that it should do this. But what I did instead was to simply sketch on a bit of paper, back of an envelope sketch, what I thought would happen if I put my equations together. Of course, they weren't buying it, but they said, well, look, we don't understand what on earth you're trying to do, but it sounds as though you need to do it. So you better be given time to do it. They did. They gave me 2 hours a day from 2 to 4 a.m. in the morning. Anyway, that destroyed my circadian rhythm rather effectively. But to come back to the point Ray is making, it's a beautiful example of multi-level causation. Just stop that voltage from varying and everything goes absolutely quiescent. The individual molecules do not produce that rhythm.
Denis, does this
Another
relate?
mistake of modern biology.
Just going to ask, does this relate to the slow and fast-moving processes that Carl Friston was talking about? Remember, we spoke about that.
Yes, that's right.
Fascinating that some of his
Yes,
ideas
and
can be
indeed
mapped onto.
so. And for processes sufficiently fast, the genome can't react in time. It takes quite a long number of minutes for the signals from the cell to change the expression level of the gene. To change the gene is days. So these are slow processes. And so when we make a decision to be cooperative or obstructive, selfish, the same genes that make the proteins in our hands or the proteins in our limbs or the proteins in our speech muscles, there's no time for even the expression levels of different proteins to change during that process. So we are cooperative when we are cooperative, and selfish when we are selfish, with precisely the same genes, precisely the same expression levels of those genes. It's utter nonsense to talk about DNA making us selfish. Now, Dawkins would say, oh, I didn't really mean it quite like that, Denis. I know, but you see, what he does in that book is utterly brilliant, but it's a deception. He doesn't know that. He doesn't even recognize that it is. But it is an illusion to think that the process arises straight from the DNA making the proteins that make us. And he writes, created us body and mind. That's supposed to be what DNA has done.
Mm.
I know, he will protest endlessly, I'm sure, that he didn't mean it quite like this. But what way did he mean it? He doesn't even know that.
Yeah.
When a philosopher, Mary Midgley, reviewed his book, The Selfish Gene, published in 1976, she reviewed it in 1979 in the journal Philosophy. And she made a remark in passing, this metaphor, the selfish gene. 3 years later, 1982, Richard Dawkins replied. He said, that was no metaphor. I believe it is the literal truth.
Mm.
But then he went on to say, provided you use words in the way that biologists now use them. What is a metaphor if it is not to use a word in a way which is not its normal range of application?
Yeah.
He doesn't even know that his own definition was to prove that it is a metaphor.
He's also he criticizes
See,
philosophy, and then he wrote a bad philosophy book called The God Delusion.
well, indeed, I'm afraid so. I mean, I've no, what's the word I want? I don't think we know what we're talking about when we talk about such things, and
Mm.
how you define it all and so on. I don't know. So I take the view that, there's a form of epistemology which I call the relativity of epistemology, which means that there are processes which you cannot in the universe know much about. We don't
Mm.
have the means to make those investigations. But you're quite right, Matt. It's actually pre 101 philosophy. Absolutely so.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so important to think about the concepts that you're discussing. I mean, I've watched the two of you talk on a few podcasts and I've really enjoyed them. And you were stressing the importance of that philosophical
Yes,
assessment of the concepts that you're dealing with in parallel with theorizing and experiments and so on. You've got to talk
exactly
about the
so.
things you're studying, you know.
You can't experiment without a hypothesis. There are scientists who claim you can. The genomics people, Yanai and Lurcher, for example, two Israeli scientists, actually claim that a hypothesis is a liability. Well, that liability was tested in genomics recently at the university where Ray is now based, University College London, my old alma mater too, by a team under the direction of Nicholas Volt, a very, very careful mathematician working in medical science of screening, medical screening. He demonstrated way back in the 1990s that the genomics process would not give you the answer to the causation of disease or for its cure if you relied entirely on associations. What did the team at UCL do in 2023? They tested the polygenic scores, that's adding together all the gene associations associated with a particular disease, cancer, cardiovascular disease, schizophrenia, you name it.
Mm.
None of that is carefully predicted by the polygenic scores.
Mm.
If you relied on it to screen people to find out who was likely to develop cancer,
Mm.
who was likely to develop cardiovascular disease, and warn them, and they could take preventative action, of course, it would be useless. It produces too many false positives, as we call them.
Mm.
A prediction that somebody will suffer from cancer, for example, that is just not true for that individual. And we wouldn't allow a drug to be used with those kinds of statistics.
Mm.
It's extraordinary. But the other thing that's extraordinary, and I want to hand over to Ray here, that's been published now for 3 years. Why on earth have the genomics people ignored it?
Mm.
This is the worst
I think the
failure
answer,
they could face. I call it the gene-centric impasse, an impossibility even of predicting disease, let alone curing it.
Mm.
it creates fundamental ethical problems. I mean, another one of my hats actually was as an ethicist. I directed a Center for Reproductive Ethics at UCL in the Institute for Women's Health. And the area that I was looking at was the impact of medical knowledge and advancement on the rights of women, essentially. Now, you know, a lot of the genomics creates fundamental ethical problems because if you're dealing with associations, and you're looking at profiles of genome expression rather than specific, if this happens, then that will happen. So if this happens in association with this, then you have an increased chance of 0.00001 that you might get a particular disease, or that you might be more inclined to alcoholism, or you might be more adept at using your fingers to play the piano than anybody else. It's a minefield, because at what point do you take notice of this association? At what point do you realize, that it's created a dilemma for the individual whose information it is that you're going to give it to? It creates even more dilemmas than that, because you take two twins, for example, two identical twins, and you find something about a profile of one twin. It sets up a whole set of interesting problematic questions. Well, do you tell the twin what you've now learned about this member of that pair? The fundamental problems. And I used to discuss this with the genomics people.
So it will affect policy, yeah, ultimately, yeah.
Well, it's difficult to say now because I'm a bit divorced from it now from an ethics point of view. At the time, I remember once addressing a meeting looking at the early onset of menopause, and which is a fundamental problem and certainly needs research. But in proteomics and genomics, people were looking at these associations. Could we identify those that were more likely to have early onset menopause and advise them, and so on in terms of reproductive health? And I made this point. This was several years ago now. This was back in 2007 or somewhere like that. Certainly before the study that Denis referred to was published, so we didn't know the outcome of that study at that time. But I did make the point that, are we not going to start setting up these difficulties of deciding who to tell, when to tell, and also when you inform people, that information has to have relevance. It has to be interpretable by that individual, not just in a textbook somewhere or some kind of academic exercise. It's now meaningful to that individual, and it can only be meaningful to them in terms of the decisions that they take about their lives, their reproductive health, if they understand what you mean by probabilities. If they understand that, yes, you've got a 0.0001 increase in getting this particular problem, but you've also got a more wonderful possibility that you'll be a first-rate grade 8 piano player. I mean, I don't, how do you balance what you do in life by those kinds of associations? I think we're making a rod to beat ourselves with.
Yeah.
And somehow or other we'll all end up playing some kind of strange blame game, if you like, or blame genes. Well, that's a bit silly, really. We could just as readily blame the kind of lifestyles that we lead and so on. And to assume that you can find a sort of an ultimate cause of fallacy, which I think was the mistake, the primary cause of something, which has to be this thing in the genome. Genes are not causal. They're crazy.
You can't, and you certainly can't separate out the variations within groups of humans in the world and condemn one group as having bad genes and the other group as having
language.
better ones. we all know where that led to in the course of the Second World War, but we're often inclined, I'm sorry to say, in biology to forget it or even to somehow put it to one side. Nothing to do with us. We're just evolutionary biologists, we're just genomics people. Well, unfortunately, it is to do with us. Francis Galton, the 19th century developer of evolutionary biology, following on from Charles Darwin, together with Wallace and Weismann and others who formed the foundations of what now is called neo-Darwinism, which I don't think Darwin is Darwinism at all, but that's another point. Anyway, they were the origin of saying, look, wouldn't it be better for humanity if the schizophrenics were sterilized, at least, and if those with this genetic problem and that genetic problem. Well, the problem with that, first of all, is which genes really are good and which are bad. It's a mixture. All genes and all molecules in the body have optimal conditions in which they can produce their beneficial effects, but there'll be other conditions in which they would produce negative effects from the point of view of benefiting the individual. We have many examples of that in, sorry, in the way that genes are used by organisms, sometimes to produce a good effect, like protection from bacterial infection, and other times a very bad effect by
I think we're all suffering with this a bit today, aren't we? And coughing. It's like
sorry,
the doctor's waiting room.
Yes, I had to turn myself off for a while
Yeah.
because I was having great difficulty.
Mm.
And, but just going that point that Denis was.
Okay.
You're right. And I said, yeah, one of the, I mean, because it's an immediate issue in the sense that we do actually select genes. And I mean that is the process of when pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, for example, is where they look for cells that are going to be implanted in IVF, and to see whether the cells that they're going to, the eggs that they're going to, the embryos that they'll transfer are, inverted commas, affected. Now, it works in if you get one-to-one relationships, really strong associations. In other words, if you've got this gene, you're pretty likely that you're going to have this problem. And so the patient can avoid implanting embryos that have got that particular genetic problem. So there's no doubt that there is a way of bypassing a genetic problem, and there's a good deal of strong ethics to suggest that that would be a process worth doing and with good ethical foundations to it. The problem comes when you start casting a net. So you're now looking not for the one-to-ones, not for the very hard, solid linkages, but you're looking now for associations. Once you start casting the net, you've got associations. Now you're looking down a microscope and you're seeing a cell. That's what you see, the embryo, or the cell that becomes the embryo. And you're testing the genes, and you're selecting those. Now, who selects? Who chooses the embryo to transplant? Whose responsibility is it? Is it the embryologist? Now, when I was working within the Institute for Women's Health, they used to tell me, as an embryologist, I would never transplant an affected embryo. Affected with what? And there lies the dilemma, you see. Now, supposing in the balance of things that the patient has a certain level of priority to reproduce. That's, after all, why they came into the process of IVF in the first place. Partly was to have children. So they've gone through that process in the IVF. They've also got a problem, which they know that there's this gene within the family that they want to try and avoid. So they've come through that process to avoid that genetic causality. I always argued that it should be the patient. If you call it a patient, there's nothing wrong with them after all. But it should be the mother and the potential father who decide and have the choice about which embryos to transfer. Just you say that an embryo is affected, and therefore, as an embryologist, I would not transplant it into the womb, then you're taking the decision. You're taking the decision away from the very people whose problem it is. And so it begs a whole lot of questions about responsibility. That's just an example, and I don't want to make too much. I did make too much of that there, but it's an example of the fact that this wrongful notion of causality, where it gives primacy to genes, is so profoundly mistaken. There can be all sorts of other ways to look at diseases and ill health than simply looking at the biological basis of them.
This takes us on to a very interesting development too that is in our book, which is that we are often represented by standard evolutionary biologists, whether they call themselves neo-Darwinists, modern synthesists, or neither of those, but all sorts of combinations of, well, with one thing central, which is natural selection is the driver of evolution. We totally disagree with that. And so we are sometimes accused of throwing away Darwin's great discovery. Well, Darwin himself knew it was not his great discovery. And he realized that, well, about a decade after writing The Origin of Species, that he had not, in fact, worked out the origin of species. He had worked out a process by which a filter could operate, and that filter he called natural selection. It was a metaphor based on artificial selection, which is humans changing the inheritance of a variety of animal or plant to develop new varieties. And of course, breeders do that all the time. But what he did in 1868 and in
So, Denis, just briefly, did he say natural just to contrast it from artificial then?
Yes, that's right. That's
So
in chapter 1, precisely. It's very clear indeed, stated explicitly in chapter 1 of The Origin of Species. But what he did in 1871 was to invent, maybe animals do that too. But he couldn't call that artificial selection because that implies human. That's what we mean by artifice, artificial. So he invented a new word. He called it sexual selection. And what he meant was this. Men in Africa choose women they think are beautiful. Men in Asia choose different shapes of women they think are beautiful. We here in the West choose yet other ones that we think are beautiful. What does that do? It produces all the various, what were formerly called the races of mankind. Of course, we don't use that term anymore because it carries eugenicist implications. But what we do say is there are a huge number of varieties. But what Darwin realized was that this was active selection by organisms. What is that magnificent peacock doing but impressing the peahen? But now that leads us to say something very interesting indeed in our book. What is in the environment? mostly other organisms. What happens between organisms? It's social interaction. What does that lead to? Some organisms prefer this person or that animal to others. What does that do? It determines which ones they mate with. What does that do? That determines inheritance down the generations. We're back to Darwin's sexual selection and the explanation of that kind of. Now, I come to the point. That's much faster. That can happen in just a generation or two. Whereas the natural selection process, as defined by Darwin in chapter 1 of The Origin of Species, is exceedingly slow. It's far too slow. And what are we finding now? There are many directional processes in evolution. What are they directed by? Not a filter. That's too slow. And we know that because, just to take a very good example, it's an icon of evolutionary biology, the peppered moth. These are the moths that, in natural circumstances, tend to attach themselves at night against the bark of whitish bark trees. And so the moths are whitish coloured, a little bit peppery, but whitish mostly. And so they're almost invisible. Bats flying around, moths are protected by that camouflage, if you like. What happened as the industrial parts of the United Kingdom became dark with soot depositing on the tree trunks, they developed quite rapidly to be largely dark. They hid themselves again. Now, we now know that's not point mutations slowly accumulating. It's been demonstrated just a few years ago. It's actually the movement of a mobile genetic element from one part of the genome to another. It's a process that's vastly faster than the original concept of natural selection, which is slow accumulation of point mutations. We think we are vastly more faithful to what we now know about the evolutionary process and to what Darwin was saying from 1871 onwards, just a decade after writing The Origin of Species. I think we are the true inheritors of Darwin, incidentally, not the neo-Darwinists.
So much so that somebody I was discussing this with the other day said to me at the end of it, when putting forward this proposition, well, Darwin was wrong. Now, this is how far they stretch themselves. When you point out to them what it really was that Darwin was saying, and that we are Darwinianists in that sense, then Darwin must be wrong. They don't like the fact that we're right. It's most peculiar. I mean, and let's take it.
Yes.
Put aside these peppered moths and things. Let's supposing that you've got. If you look at the speed of change of society, the speed of change of the way in which we socially interact and organize ourselves.
Language, yeah.
It's massively fast. Now, there's a lot of selective processes going on within that are to do with cooperativeness, that, yes, are to do with certain aspects of selfishness, mutualism, all sorts of things that will affect different kinds of behaviors. And indeed, when you look at our behaviors, you'll find a huge variety of different kinds of behavior systems, different kind of ways of behaving within that. There are some people who would take advantage of that communality. Yes, indeed. And there's also some societies that punish that taking advantage of it, at least if you do so in too much of an egregious way. So there are all sorts of selective pressures, not just simply sexual selective pressures, but social selective pressures that would enhance the survival of those who do cooperate better, who do at the end of the day aid and assist, rather than simply act selfishly. And it's one of the reasons why you don't find selfishness in genes. You find selfishness within societies. You find the taking advantage of our communalism, not communism there, if you know what I mean, but our ability to act together, to work together, to produce purposes and aims and objectives that enhance our well-being within our society. And we argue about that. That's where I came from originally, the political argument about, well, what kind of society is extraordinary. We could actually sit and debate what kind of society we want. It is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And
We can guide evolution, as you pointed out earlier. We can actually guide it.
It's right back to that problem that I had as a teenager, looking at Karl Marx and so on, and finding particularly that encapsulated in that one phrase of, it's not the consciousness of man that determines his existence, it's his existence that determines his consciousness. But a system is a system. Consciousness influences the system, and the system influences the consciousness influences the system. We are influencing each other in this dialogue, in this discussion. Hopefully it will influence others, and hopefully others will not be influenced by it. In other words, they have a choice not to be influenced by it. They can say, I don't agree with that, which is fine, because that's part of the process of change, that we can disagree. There's no fixed process for society to change in any particular kind of way. It's dependent very much on the way in which we organize ourselves politically and make decisions. Decisions are a key thing within understanding living systems. How are choices made? It's a fundamental, because it's definitive of living systems that they do make such choices at different levels of organization. So there are choices that are made at that level of creativity, where, in other words, you really create new ways of doing something. You think through a process and think, what if we did this differently? Just theoretically, let's imagine doing something differently. Could we create the technology in order to do this? Supposing next time we went to the moon, we did it differently. The next time we went to the moon, we considered how much better it would be if we did it with this technology or that technology and so on. That is what humans do. That's why we're cranes. That's why we've created all these things that enable us to do things.
I love that, Ray, because what you're granting humans the power to change.
Yes.
And there's nothing worse than facing those cynics that say, "Oh no, we're the violent ape. We can't change.
Oh.
We're doomed to perpetual war." And so it's so refreshing to hear hard scientists, empiricists talking about these things and saying, "No, there is scope for change and freedom." Yeah,
it's exactly that. It's what
Well,
drove
we
me
actually,
all those years ago. It's what drove me, Matt. I mean, I
it's
kind
so
of
important. It's so
Yeah.
important.
I felt so disillusioned looking at this very sad way of looking at humanity, let's say humanity at the moment, and then pretending that there was a science that gave the answer to it. That was the other thing that I found about it all. This is science, they said to me. And I thought, no, hang on a second. Science would be seeking to understand how we are creative. Science wouldn't necessarily be seeking to understand how we are stagnant, how we are stuck rigidly in a particular system. After all, to quote another Marxist thing, philosophers had interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And I would say,
yes, exactly.
how could they have it both ways? We felt that these two things are completely contradictory. I'm sure the Marxists would argue with me and say, "Oh no, you've misunderstood," etc. Fine, let's misunderstand, but let's have an open discussion about the misunderstanding. And that's all we're asking in science as well, in terms of what we understand about what Darwin meant by these things, or what we mean by these things, and to try and suggest that there's no purposiveness, that you shouldn't use teleological language is the other thing. You naughty, naughty, naughty. This cell is doing this in order to do this. No, naughty, naughty, naughty. It's just simply the product of it doing it. Well, what can I say then? In order to achieve, no, naughty, naughty, naughty. You've got no language. You can discuss anything. You go to the man at the bus stop. You can no longer talk to the man in the bus stop, because you've got to create sentences that rule out any kind of purpose attributed to anything within the living system at all, which is completely bonkers. This pencil was created for a purpose. What was it created by? It was created by somebody like me. who wanted to write about purposefulness and who wanted to write creatively. This is what this is. This is one of the most extraordinary bits of evolution, this thing I'm holding up here. It's a pencil. Here's another one. Because one of the other things about being, you have to see the world in various ways. And if you don't have these, sometimes you do it rather badly. Well, it didn't arise just out of nothingness. It didn't arise just out of non-purposefulness. It arose out of purpose in order to enhance this vision. And because we don't, I in particular have very poor vision and so on. Well, this is evolution. Just
Ray, could I just briefly ask him? Sorry, go on, Dennis.
Yes, there's a very important distinction here, and it illuminates what Ray is saying. There is, as it were, hard inheritance, which is what largely we pass on, both in the DNA that we pass on to subsequent generations, but also in the cell structure that we pass on. They forget that. They always say, oh, it's only DNA that determines the organism. It's not true. I was asked when debating with Richard Dawkins 4 years ago in the festival in Hay-on-Wye, when it comes to the question of hard and soft inheritance, DNA being the hard inheritance, epigenetics altering the way the organism interprets the DNA, either by marking it with various chemical processes or by just changing the way the functionality of the organism works as a system. Well, that might be inherited down 1 or 2 generations, but then it dies out. I said, no, Richard, that's not the way it happens. Think of this for a moment. If an epigenetic change is initiated by an environmental change, it's getting too hot, which it may in this world now, or some other process which has an epigenetic effect on the organism. If that environmental change continues long into the far distant future, so will the epigenetic change, whether or not it causes DNA change. And that is misunderstood. I don't understand why. It is blindingly obvious that if an epigenetic change produced by a change in the environment, heat, for example, continues indefinitely into the future, so will the epigenetic change, and that is then inherited. That's been proven, incidentally. The change in our bodies gets communicated to the germline. Darwin also thought that was the case. Darwin was a Lamarckian. In 1868, he even explained how it happens. He said, there are particles that come from the cells of my body and tell the genome what to do. It was absolutely, well, not the genome, because he didn't call it that, the germ cells, the egg and sperm. Well, he's absolutely right. In the last 22 decades, roughly, we've found the tiny particles he was referring to. They're called extracellular vesicles. What do? They carry control RNAs down to the germ cells that determine the metabolism for the future embryo. And if that is an environmental induced change, it will continue down through the generations. There are various respects in which, I'm sorry to say, the standard evolutionary biologists seem almost to deliberately misunderstand what we're saying. I think we have backed up every part of that little book, Understanding Living Systems, with firm experimental evidence, and we're continuing to publish all of that in what we write today. To sum it up, the central dogma is not correct. It's neither central nor dogmatic, shouldn't be. There are no dogmas in science. And the detailed experimental data on which that claim is based has all been published, and people can look it all up. No question at all. On the question whether epigenetic change can be inherited, that also is fully documented now. I don't understand why people are resisting.
because it's going to undermine their philosophical worldview and what they thought they were. And
I'm
I
afraid
think
so.
it's
It
probably
comes down
easier.
in the end correctly to a
Mm,
philosophical viewpoint,
mm,
which people are totally reluctant to abandon. And I understand why. I lived as a student through the period of the central dogma being formulated. 1958 was my undergraduate graduation year. That's when the central dogma was first formulated. By the time I was publishing my PhD in 1961, it was firmly established. It even convinced Julian Huxley to change his concept of the modern synthesis, saying, oh, well, the proteins have now been dethroned in favor of the nucleotides. Well, I don't know what he means by that, to be honest. The proteins are still what enable us to move, but neither the proteins nor the DNA decide which direction we shall move, who we meet, who we like, who we hate. That's choice up to us.
I have to say also that one of the things that our detractors now say is that, but the modern synthesis and neo-Darwinism have nothing to do with evolution. Now, you may think, that can't be right, can it? That is indeed what I have been told by people that I have been discussing this with. Suddenly, now they are pushing aside neo-Darwinism, pushing aside. The reason for that is, of course, is because there never was sufficient evidence to support the tenets of it.
mm,
Uh, just simply taking the transmission through the germline, a barrier was erected. It was erected
Yes.
the creativity that we were talking about earlier, socially. It was a socially created barrier that created a barrier in the physical system.
mm.
But it was socially created. It had to exist because it had to exist in order to prevent transmission through the germline, as if somehow there was a sin in transmitting anything through the germline. And so there was a barrier. Now, we're physiologists.
Original sin.
Original sin. Now, we're physiologists. Whenever we hear the
Original
word,
sin.
yes,
Well, I'm
whenever
not
we
being
hear,
quite serious.
Yeah.
What on earth is in his genes? But original sin. What were all of those people who were killed during the Holocaust? Well, they had bad genes. Original sin. My
Mm,
God, does
mm.
he know what he's? I don't know what to say.
Yeah, it's like a religion. So it
Sometimes
sounds like a
I'm
religion,
left
doesn't it? Mm,
utterly shocked.
mm,
Of course, modern evolutionary biologists will distance themselves entirely from anything to do with the Holocaust.
mm,
But it seems to me to be blindingly obvious that what the Nazis were trying to do in Germany was effectively implementing Galton's program
mm,
from way back in the 19th century. It takes decades for changes in science to influence politicians.
mm. Yeah, but
We
yes.
know that for many other reasons, of course, the global warming issue being
Mm,
a very good example of that and very pertinent example today. So it's not surprising that, well, I think in relation to interpreting genetics and interpreting it in any philosophical way, ethical way, we have to be very careful
mm,
about the language we use here. I find it necessary to first of all explain why there are, in principle, no bad genomes. There are bad people who choose to be
mm.
bad.
Well, have you seen Mike Levin's Planaria? I mean, they've got dirty genomes. He says they've got loads of junk DNA, but they never
Oh,
get
yes.
cancer. They never
Well,
get
there's no
cancer,
junk
and they're
DNA.
basically immortal.
No, there's absolutely no junk DNA. I mean, it's all got uses, and most of it is producing RNAs that form part of the networks that determine the processes of physiological
Mm,
function.
mm,
the saddest thing too is that if you erect barriers in this kind of way to ideas, you're never going to study them.
mm,
Because first of all, you've got to find ways of getting funded to study them. So if the scientific community locks itself in
mm,
to one particular materialistic way of looking at something, mechanistic way of looking at something, and will prioritize that in terms of funding. In other words, you've got to now start looking at the genetics. This is the key. If only we could understand the genetics, then we would be able to predict all these possible diseases and what their ultimate solution is. And the funding gets piled in. The politicians pick it up. Politicians were involved in announcing the genome, in announcing the very first unraveling of the human genome. What politicians got to do with it? You know, I didn't see politicians getting involved in the discovery of, let's say, how action potentials are generated in nerve impulses. When Hodgkin and Huxley, when they presented their work on how action potentials are generated in the nervous system, in nerve cells, all fortuitously due to the discovery of this whacking great big giant axon, this giant fiber in the squid. I didn't see politicians waiting, and forgive me if I'm wrong, announcing a massive big breakthrough. But from that one understanding of how action potentials are generated and how nervous systems, how nerve cells work, so much more was learnt. Where were the politicians?
So why do you think they were more interested? Why? So do you think it's because they support the DNA-centric view?
Yeah.
And because it's useful to it's useful for managing human society. If we say that we're determined, essentially.
Exactly.
They don't know better is the answer, unfortunately. But you see, they're going to have to face this because that failure of the genome process, the genome sequencing, to even predict, well, let's go through it again. Cancer, cardiovascular disease, those two account for 60% of all fatality. Schizophrenia and the processes of dementia of various kinds, that accounts for the rest. Nearly all the diseases of mankind that are not determined by a single gene, those only affect about 4% of the population, incidentally. Those are the monogenetic diseases for which there can always be a hope for a genetic cure. But for the rest, the answer is a complete failure to do what the genome sequencing project promised. The leader, Francis Collins of the NIH in 1999, wrote in 1999, just a year or so before the announcement of the first sequencing of the human genome in 2001, in 2010, you will take your genome to your doctor if you've got cancer, and he will prescribe you a drug to cure that cancer. Nobody has ever taken their genome to a general practitioner if they've got cancer. Nor would the general practitioner have any idea what it means, nor does the patient know what it means. The answer, I'm afraid, is a big disaster. We don't have those cures. But at the same time, we have a health crisis. You plot the number of people who are now older than 75. It's over the last 15 years that population has grown enormously. So has the cost of the health service. The two graphs follow each other perfectly. It's unsupportable. The politicians know that. They'll have to find a way now of saying to the medical scientists, you're going to have to change the direction. We're going to have to find ways to do this in the way you used to do it in the 20th century. First half of the 20th century was one discovery after another that transformed humanity from the point of view of curing major diseases. We've got to go back to that kind of process. It won't come from genomics. And the earlier that politicians realize this has been a failure, I call it the gene-centric impasse. It is an impasse because there's no way through it. You can read the genomics papers until the cows come home. They will use all kinds of manipulations of the various association scores to pretend that they're measuring causation. They're not. There is nothing in what they do that measures a physiological process, the dynamics that make it the case that this process is wrong and is a disease state, and this one is right and it works. They don't measure that, nor do they measure all the factors that constrain what the physiological processes are. Those are all ignored. You can't ignore them. In any equations for what is happening, you'd have to incorporate them. Any mathematician knows that. You've got to have the boundary conditions. That's all the cellular structure. Cellular structure is vast. Its information is at least as big as the genome.
But
I'm saying this is a major threat, both to humanity as it's developed in the developed world, to the point at which we've got aging populations for which the cures do not exist, and the costs of that are simply shocking.
But also, in a systemic sense, some of the most effective ways, and I want to be careful in how I put this, one of the effective ways is caring. Because caring matters in terms of what happens physiologically. And we've lost sight of that, I think. We've been so busy looking for technological cure, for ways of dealing with, that we've created a clinical environment that isn't that has lost that caring element to it. Caring matters. If you talk in a caring way to somebody, you will do all sorts of things to their system in terms of endocrinology. One thing that you will end up doing is to enhance the release of, for example, just one example, nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide plays an extraordinary role. It's actually a gas, so it can't be a gene for it. Not specifically, anyway. It can't be a gene, it's a gas that's released by the cells, and it controls the blood temperature. It controls the stiffness of the vessels, of the blood vessels. So if you struggle like me to breathe, and the origin of this problem is cardiovascular, and so on. One of the crucial things is to recreate the elasticity of the system, of the cardiovascular system, to stop it being so stiff. Because my heart is having to work so hard to get blood pumped to my lung in order that I can get oxygen and get rid of CO2, the waste products of metabolism. And that puts a strain on the heart. And when you look at my heart, I mean, you'll find that I've been, yes, rescued by technology, because I was rescued by a triple cardiac bypass some nearly 10 years ago now, which is fantastic. But I can't say that's great. I can go on living as I did before because, I want to try and ensure that my heart doesn't come under pressure again, under stress again. And the only way to do that is to try and find ways of relaxing the cardiovascular system. And it's just even just things, touch and stroking and things like this. And intimacy has an impact on that system. Now, we don't study this enough. It's always as if we've started treating these kind of things as old wives' tales and things like this. Well, this is why I said earlier, I've got to be careful how I put this, because people will think I'm a nutter, you see, like a tree hugger or something.
Tree hugging's good for you as well.
Well, it probably is. It probably is. Well, certainly being within nature, in an environment, there is a sort of a peacefulness in a strange kind of sense. We know that meditation influences the way the cardiovascular system operates and functions.
Oh, that's well known. The heart rate can go way down if you use the right breathing technique in a meditative stance. I mean, that's documented.
Yeah.
But wouldn't we be better, you see, trying to create environments where this understanding can be better utilized, better ways of doing it. I actually firmly believe that there are some doctors that are really good at being doctors, not because of else with them, but simply because they have this caring process. Do you know, I'll be careful. Maybe you can cut this bit out. The worst thing when you're being interviewed, as I used to say to people, I used to go around and talk to schools about applying to study medicine. And one of my hats, you see, was a sub-dean in a medical school. Another one was an ethicist. Another one was I've just so many
You're quite
different,
busy.
very busy, and so many things that I've looked at. But anyway, and I used to go down and around and talk to schools about applying to do medicine because a lot of children are disadvantaged in doing this because they don't know how to. They don't know how to fill in the forms really. What do they need to say to encourage people to think that they might be a good, decent doctor? Well, in those days, we used to advise them not to say when asked the question, "Why do you want to be a doctor?" Don't say it's because you care. Well, because it leads
I
to
shouldn't laugh, but that's just crazy.
it leads to trick questions. Because the next question you're going to be asked is, why don't you be a nurse? Now you've got yourself stuck in a dilemma because the only way you can answer that question is to imply that being a nurse is less worthy than being a doctor.
Mm,
So you've got yourself stuck. So don't say you care. So this was a problem in a sense. And I mean, I think that by all means tell them that you care,
mm,
that it's part of the process and so on, because you're working within an environment. And if you answer that, look, we work within an environment of people that are there to help and support people
mm.
in a caring way.
Yeah.
That's what we do. We do it from specific
Mm,
roles.
yeah.
One is specifically diagnostic, which may or may not involve any kind of caring. Usually it doesn't. It's done by some diagnostic center that doesn't know you from Adam. It just looks at cells under a microscope and comes to a conclusion. Now, you don't even need to do it by them, the
Mm,
people. That probably be done by AI or something, or count the number of cells that have got this particular color or whatever it is, and that's that in your diagnostic. That's not caring. It's caring in the sense that it's wonderful that it's done, so you know, got to get a diagnosis as early as possible and so on. But when you took a look at the team that is involved in looking after
mm.
people, then it matters. You play a role within it and you work as a team. You
Yeah.
don't simply come in and say, I'm the doctor. Or you come in and say, I'm the nurse. I mean, so I don't know how we got onto this. But anyway,
No, it's really
it's,
interesting. I mean, most of
it's,
the healing
it's,
goes on in
society,
nursing,
it's at a
doesn't it?
society, it's what we're talking about at a society level.
Mm,
Actually,
Uh,
Ray, it's important for another reason too. A very big difference between us and most other evolutionary biologists is that we are also medical scientists.
mm,
We bring a medical science perspective onto evolution. It's been excluded in the past because, as Richard Dawkins will say, Denis, you are a physiologist. You're concerned with the functioning of the body. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm just concerned with what's in the gene pool.
mm.
Well, we are both. And that's a big difference.
Could I put a question to you, gents? I'm just conscious we've been at this for quite a while, but there was one thing I wanted to ask you. The biggest problem in my head is the idea of morphology and target forms and target shapes, and the idea of geckos regrowing limbs, and how does it know to stop there, and where is that
mm.
blueprint stored? So, do you guys have any opinions on that? I mean, I know that Mike Levin's looked at this, and I still can't quite wrap my head around these bioelectric fields, and because they're generated by the cells, right? But then
Mm.
they guide the
Well,
cell. So it's a
that that deals with an article that I published in Nature just a year ago.
oh right.
DNA is not the blueprint for life.
Mm,
That
yeah.
sums it up.
But
And it
where
was
is it?
Denis
Where is
that
the
asked me
blueprint?
to write that. No, we think it's everywhere within the organism. And remember what we said earlier on, the body characteristics are inherited just as much as the DNA.
Mm,
Cells are constrained by other cells. This is true. I mean, almost all of us have got precancerous cells.
Yes,
mm,
Uh,
exactly.
and perhaps we can take the almost out, and we
The
all have.
immune system is trying to keep that
Yeah,
down.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a constraint, as it were, by neighboring cells. The health of a tissue is determined by the cells that make up the tissue. And it's in that processing, that localized processing, that things can sometimes go wrong. In other words, that the constraint is not sufficient. And also the positioning of a precancerous cell within the tissue matters because in certain positions it's got less constraint on it, and therefore it's more likely to move on to being a cancerous cell.
mm.
growing without
Incidentally, yes, just sorry, coming in again. Incidentally, this also relates to what Darwin was up to. Darwin was a physiologist. From around 1871 to his death in 1882, he collaborated with a young physiologist called George Romanes. They were trying to prove Darwin's theory for the inheritance of acquired characteristics. They didn't succeed in that, but they did succeed in formulating something that Romanes took on afterwards, which was what they called physiological selection. That's the process by which you can get branching speciation, because there's a difference in the reproductive process between varieties of a species, whether that is psychological or physiological. Either can do it.
Speciation actually is a multifaceted process.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
the more we understand that, the better. I mean, and in fact, one of the great problems for Darwin was that, in spite of the title of his book, "The Origin of Species," um, he didn't really fully understand how you could get speciation,
Yeah.
and it always was a problem.
It bothered him, in fact, that he didn't. That's
Yeah.
right. Yes. And they were trying very hard. Well, in fact, of course, had they got the microscopic evidence we've got from electron microscopes and fluorescence microscopy, they could have done it way back in 1871. But they didn't have that facility. They only had the primitive light microscope, and there was no way of detecting the small vesicles that communicate all of this information. We now know they're there. Darwin was right.
How did he know that though, Denis, without the
He
instrument? Was
didn't,
it
and
just
he
an
said,
instinct? It's just an instinct.
he said quite clearly, I do not have a way of proving this. But he did the right thing. He tried with George Romanes, a physiologist, to prove it. He failed. I don't think he ever wrote anything to acknowledge he'd failed, but he never wrote anything either to claim that he'd succeeded. He said, look, it's a hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis that's being tested today and it works. Oh, you've gone to unmute yourself, Ray.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I get confused as to whether I'm muted or not muted. It's a fundamental ethical problem. But to mute or not to mute. No, science, for science to progress, it has to have a process of conjecture.
Yes, exactly.
And if it doesn't have that or allow it, now sometimes that conjecture can be social between scientists. In other words, you've got to be brave. You've got to be brave in doing this, because otherwise you get torn to shreds, as it were. If you produce, if, for example, I said, I think that the real problem with consciousness is that we would understand it better if we saw it as a more fundamental aspect of living systems and not a complex one. Because if we didn't think of it in terms of complexity, we wouldn't be looking for it as an emergent property. We'd be looking for it as an essential property of living systems.
Hard problem goes out the window.
Yeah, and basic. Now, so when you, what is the route for being able to present such an idea? You see, we need more. We need to be more amenable to ideas. Then, when you've got those ideas, you say, how can this be tested? But you won't get to that second stage unless you've already gone through the first stage. Physics knows this. I mean, when you look at quantum mechanics, for example, and so on, you find a lot of speculative stuff going on.
sure.
And a lot of discussion mathematically often about what is possible and what's not possible and so on. We need more of that in biology. But unfortunately, the journals tend to be stricter and stricter in not allowing speculative papers. And I think this is a shame. I mean, there are some exceptions, and you can still write
So
theoretical.
even to this day, that's the case. I mean, in spite of the efforts of gentlemen like yourselves and Mike Levin and everybody else, that's still there. So you could still lose your job if you say the wrong thing about
Oh,
this.
yes, there's no
Really?
question
I mean, I
about
just
it.
find that crazy. It's just like totally
Yeah,
unscientific. That's totally unscientific.
yes. No, for 10 years between 2006 when I published The Music of Life, which is the first book in which I challenged the gene-centric ideas,
Mm,
um, and 2016 when a major meeting was organized by me and a number of other people at the Royal Society in London, I was subject to huge abuse in the social media for even challenging the standard theory of evolution. I was described as a moron, as here we go again, Darwin was wrong. Well, actually, most of the time I claim that Darwin was right as it happens, but there we go. But I've documented all of this. I gave a lecture in 2016 to the Physiological Society, that's on the internet,
mm.
can be seen on my website, still there. And I said, look, this is all deep misunderstanding. They haven't read what I've written.
Yeah. But to face vitriol, though, Dennis, for a scientific position it's just wrong, isn't it? It's just totally immoral.
Well,
You know,
uh,
I'm
I
sorry. I'm sorry you went through that.
I
It's horrible to
I
hear that.
find it astonishing the degree of denigration
Yeah.
occurred. It closed, at least in the publishable work, not on social media itself, um, but in journals and so on. We're much more respected now. We even publish in the journal called Evolutionary Biology,
Mm,
you know, and many other major journals, journals of the Royal Society, journals of the Physiological Society, you name it, we do it. But that transformation has occurred over the last 10 years since 2016. And I also find when I'm lecturing around the world to younger people, there's hardly any opposition. I don't know where the standard neo-Darwinists have actually gone. And I don't know.
they're in hiding.
Well, they don't. Well, over there in East Asia, they don't exist.
Mm,
In fact, the question I get asked often when lecturing over there, I'm a professor at one of the major Korean universities, Daegu Gyeongbuk Institute of Science and Technology, but that doesn't matter. Happens to be just one of those nice long Korean names. Um, no, I find the problem isn't so much opposition to what we're saying, but this is brilliant. We've got new objectives, new openings. These issues are open to experimentation. And that's what we also say in our book.
mm,
You know, this is an approach to science which ought to be its ideal. What has not yet been fully proven, and are there cracks in the evidence that we should investigate? Well, those cracks are being looked at very carefully. And what
mm,
I find when I lecture around the world now, particularly to young audiences, is huge enthusiasm for what we're telling them.
mm. Can I just reflect on this term, awakening Earth? And I think I think Ray, you've used that term a couple of times, and Dennis, you know I'm a bit speculative at times, and I like to extend the metaphysical inquiry, but I mean that smacks of some kind of Gaia
Yes.
like thing, and so perhaps I'm interested in asking, do you think that there's some sort of meta meta sort of cognition within nature writ large? Does it know what it's doing in some way? Or indeed, must it in some way be able
It
to?
doesn't have to know what it's doing, but whether it does, I have no idea.
That's a good
I
way
don't
to
know
put
how
it.
one would know. If I were, no, if I were a cell of
Brilliant
if I were
answer.
a cell of my body, if I were a cell of my body, I know that I would be using intelligence as a cell of my body. If I'm an organism within an ecosystem, I'm using eco-intelligence, ecological intelligence. Is there something beyond that intelligence that we use in various ways that we're not necessarily aware of? Well, I don't know that. I wouldn't. You see, again, I don't. One doesn't want to close off any kind of idea at the periphery of our understanding.
This reminds me of Denis's Wild Ideas Fund. He put 10% a
Yeah,
year,
yeah.
10% into the one, which I
Exactly. Yes.
absolutely adore
Now, I don't want to go bonkers with it, of course.
that.
Um, it's certainly not the case that any idea is worth an equal amount at any time. That's certainly true. You've got to have some kind of foundation for what it is you're speculating on. We speculate a bit on it in terms of intelligence because I asked, people once asked me, is there anything beyond us? And my answer to that is almost immediate. Well, of course. I mean, when I die, the system goes on. I'm not essential to the system. I wish I was, but I'm not.
You're
Actually, I don't,
helpful. You're helpful.
because it would create enormous responsibility. Um,
Yeah.
but there's something that goes on. So, I mean, there is a social intelligence, for example, that goes on. It's transmitted transgenerationally. That's certainly been the true. Even without books, that was certainly the case. That obviously there were limitations to how far it could be translated. Very often it might have been culturally translated through song, through poetry, through ways of expressing the environment, the ecosystem that organisms or human beings we're talking about now found themselves, early humanids found themselves to be able to say to others, this is what I found. This is what we did in relation to that problem. It didn't work, or it did work, or whatever, and we learn from it. So there's something going on in a learning sense that enables us to use intelligence in ways that, as individuals, we wouldn't be able to do. Which is why we create universities. It's also, I have to say, it's also one reason why people create cathedrals. And we may argue about whether creating cathedrals is a better way of doing it than creating universities. I go for the latter. But I'm not averse to the idea that there may be some benefits from creating the cathedrals. But we do this and we create things that are going to last beyond us as individuals. In that sense, there is a commonality, I call it, um, of thought that exists beyond us as individuals. How far and how much we contribute to it, I think we all contributed to it to some degree or other, even if it's just localized within a family. Even if it's just the fact that we culturally choose things to do, things and what we regard as being wonderful or good or excellent. So we create music, we create art, and this lasts in its influence upon us beyond us as individuals. How does it do that? This is the most amazing thing because take music, for example. You can get the same effects. If you look physiologically, you can get the same physiological effects from somebody who is, born after the composer as you could when the composer lived, if you see what I mean. There's something in the nature of the music that does what it does to the system. So I don't know. It doesn't really answer your question, I suppose. It's a bit rambling. But there is something, yeah, there is something beyond us as individuals. But I don't necessarily, it's organized in the sense of a social organization to it. but it's loose and it's open.
Mm.
It isn't anything like the kind of slightly more closed system that we identify in, say, an organism or even within a habitat.
Mm.
It's slightly more looser, but because it's looser, it can be more productive,
Right.
more creative, I should say, rather than more productive. More
Mm.
open society goes back to right at the very beginning. I mean, one of the other books that influenced me enormously was Open Society and Its Enemies. And the idea of open systems, I think, and Karl Popper's emphasis of open systems was, I think, absolutely vital. And it's vital to understanding living systems.
Mm.
They're creative because they're open. And they can be creative because they're open, because they get inputs from without and inputs from within. They can be in particular states of being, a process of being. And those states can be altered, and they can be altered by what goes on beyond us. They can be altered by our music, our poetry, our loves, our
Mm.
desires, and that are held in common. Um,
Is it possible to optimize? Dennis said something about optimized optimum condition of certain cellular arrangements and things. And I just wondered, does that sort of apply at the macro scale? Could we say that there's an optimized, and I'm wondering whether things like mental health issues are distance from that optimum condition, if you like. Do you see what I mean?
there's a dysfunctionality, and I find this, and you're absolutely right, Matt. I think there's an increasing dysfunctionality,
Yeah.
a disconnect. We're losing, in a sense, we're losing our ecological intelligence,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
that's creating a fundamental dysfunctionality. We are distantiated from place.
Mm.
If that's, I
And
know
again,
this.
this is to do with a scientific or philosophical understanding that leads to these issues. I mean, that's
Yeah,
yet more evidence that that mind is just
yeah.
as much of a player in this game as anything else.
Very, very big player, a huge
Mm.
player, which is in fact exactly what I was trying to get at when I was saying that, whether there is answering the question, whether there is something that beyond the
Mm.
individual.
This,
And, you know, I don't, how is there a fundamental problem with the disconnect? And whether there is, whether you can demonstrate it by an increase in things like mental health conditions.
well, I was going to go on to that, Ray,
Yeah.
because we can identify no less than 300 genes that have associations with schizophrenia. Similarly, for Alzheimer, none have been shown to be causal. Not only that, the genomic data is also not effectively predicting who will get it and who won't. Schizophrenia was actually one of the major challenges that the Genome Project, when it was launched in the 1990s, claimed was be one of its first successes because it runs in families.
Mm,
It does, but it runs in families because of poverty.
mm, mm.
Almost full stop.
Mm.
That, I think, explains most of the familial nature of the transmission. That's been demonstrated. There's a beautiful article by Torrey that I refer to in some of our recent papers. I think in the paper with Ray in evolutionary biology, I think we do that. But if we don't, it's there. Torrey has exposed all of this perfectly well in relation to the genetics of schizophrenia, and I think the same must also be true for the various dementias.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because if you go back to the 1960s, I remember lots of discussions then about diseases like schizophrenia, and dysfunctionality in relation to family and so on as being a fundamental cause. I mean, there was R.D. Laing, for example. I mean, forgive me because I
Yes,
can't
indeed.
remember that R.D. Laing was one of the principal sort of advocates of the fact that it was a familial thing, but it was to do with the dysfunctionality,
Yeah,
not the disconnect and the dysfunctionality, and not with anything else, or genetics or whatever. And we seem to have come full circle on that now and understood that you actually can't pinpoint a particular biological cause, that it is a social
that's
fabric.
right. And sadly, a eugenic experiment was done in the 1940s, which failed. 160,000 schizophrenics were also murdered in the Holocaust. What happened immediately after the war? The number of schizophrenics in Germany was lower, naturally. Within a few years, back to where it was before.
Yeah.
It's sad to say that that experiment was done for obvious reasons. It should never have been done. But what it does show is that it can't have been genetic.
Mm.
With absolute certainty, I would suggest.
With
Yeah.
close to certainty, yes. I think that's all documented again.
As you say, Dennis, it's just shocking that it's,
That's also in Torrey's article.
yeah.
Right.
Sad note on which to come near to a
Well,
stop, because I
perhaps
think
I could I lighten it
exhausted
with
you
what
for at least 2 hours.
perhaps I lighten the mood a little bit by referencing the Oxford troubadours, because
Oh,
I've been
yes.
delving into that a little bit, and it's sort of 12th century music,
Yes,
and
it's 12th century music
it's
in origin,
fantastic.
but it's also got a modern tradition. The troubadours exist today in the modern form of groups like Nadal, Perigudo. Ray is fantastic at singing Nadal's
Wow.
songs and at singing Jalfi Rudel, who's a 12th century troubadour.
So how did this come about? And you guys have got a lot on already with lots of hats and hardline signs and this. How do you?
Well,
What's your secret?
come to our concert on the 28th of May in the Maison Française of Oxford. Yes, we will be performing again there. But,
Could I come?
we
Could I
do
actually come and
bring,
see you?
yes, of course.
Oh
It's
my God.
just a matter of booking with the Maison Française. It's on the website, the Maison Française Oxford. It'll be, I don't know whether it's advertised just yet, but it will very soon when
But
they
it's an
put up the
interesting
term.
example. Sorry, Dennis, I'm interrupting you.
Yes, carry on. Yes,
It's an interesting example of what we've just been talking about at a
yes.
social level, because the interesting thing is that that culture could have died out. The Occitan culture, it was forbidden
Yes,
for people to speak. Children were punished if they spoke Occitan in their school.
Wow.
And therefore parents would advise them not to. And so there was a whole generation where they didn't learn it maternally. But that's being slowly but surely reversed. They started setting up schools where it would be taught as a language, language in which you learnt, and so on. But it flourished. One of the major factors in holding it together and preventing it dying out was song and poetry. It's the language of some of the greatest poets.
yes, exactly.
And that, and it is the most extraordinary lyrical language. It's musical and it's inherently musical. And so it's a fascinating example. The young people are now learning it.
How many speakers are there, do you think, worldwide? Is it like less than Welsh or something? I mean,
Few 100,000 is probably the answer, but nobody can be absolutely
Nobody
sure.
was certain, and hopefully it's growing.
Yes.
Why hopefully? What does it matter whether it survives or
there's a
not?
curiosity, and it has some aesthetic
Yeah,
content that might distinguish it from other forms.
but also I think understanding ourselves
Mm,
is so
Indeed.
important
Who am I?
in
mm.
Yes.
what its significance is. I mean, and that's true of all literature, it seems to me. We play games with literature because we can never experience the entirety of the world. So there's a limit to our learning, and we learn from others' learning and others' imagination. And
There's something magical about poetry, though, isn't there? This idea that you can convey a
yeah,
whole volume of notions and ideas just within a few sentences. You know, people can write PhDs about one sonnet, you know.
oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
that it's kind of almost compression. It's some sort of information compression in a way. It's
Yeah,
Right.
it's a way of yeah, absolutely right. It's a way of transmitting a huge amount of information, yeah, particularly often about emotional things, which of course is very much spiritual than material emotion, even though actually we know an awful lot about what's going on.
There's certain music that just makes me cry. It just
Perhaps me too.
and then it's not sorrow.
Yeah.
It's tears of I don't know,
It's joy,
ecstasy.
almost joy sometimes.
But you know, Matt, there is a
Things
very
like
strong.
joy and love and desire. There's a lot of the troubadour poetry and song is about unrequited love.
Indeed,
And a
that's
lot
right.
of good love songs are. I mean, poor souls, So
Yeah. Is there
really
anything worse?
they're never going to attain what they really want to attain. And they always
Exactly
fall in
so.
love with people that are either above them socially, in which case it's not going to be, or they're miles apart. Distance from a long way, this love for this woman, and people have died in literature. They've died as a result of this love.
Well, I was going
Died.
to comment, Matt, that this does have a connection with our main discussion today because what does the word troubadour mean? It's a researcher.
Yeah.
Really?
Troubar
Yeah, yeah.
is the Occitan word for to find. What
Wow.
does a researcher try to do? He tries to find new things.
Yeah.
What does a troubadour do? He finds new ways of expressing love.
Of course, yeah, I love that. What a
And
lovely
in
what.
turn, that determines who mates with whom and how it all happens that we evolve.
Yeah,
My goodness. Yes, it's all connected.
isn't it? Well, I think that's a wonderful moment to perhaps bring this to an end now. I'm getting a little bit tired, unless you guys want to continue for a while. I mean, it's up to you.
I think we have we're grateful to you, Matt, because on my little list, as I discussed with Ray earlier today, of what we might cover, I think we covered it all.
Oh, I absolutely think we did. But
Okay.
yeah. But anyway, this has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you both. Thank you so much. You brought
Pleasure for us too.
so many ideas and interesting thoughts to the table. That yeah, it's a wellspring. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye
gentlemen.
then.
Take care. Bye
Bye.
bye.
Say